unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. The making of India's constitution is usually told as the story of the few hundred prominent lawyers, politicians, and intellectuals who comprise the Constituent Assembly, the body tasked with drafting this historic document between 1946 and 1949. But a new book by the scholars Rohit and Ornit Shani, Assembling India's Constitution, A New Democratic History, argues this familiar account captures only a small part of the story. Drawing on a remarkable range of archival material, the book shows that constitution making was not confined to the halls of the Constituent Assembly alone. It also played out in provincial legislatures, princely states, government offices, civic associations, and communities across India. Ordinary citizens debated the Constitution, they petitioned its authors, they organized around it, and they creatively sought to shape its provisions. To discuss the book and its relevance for our understanding of India's democratic evolution, Rohit and Ornit join me on the show this week. Rohit is a professor of history at Yale University and the author of A People's Constitution, The Everyday Life of Law in the Indian Republic. Ornit is an associate professor of Asian studies at Haifa University, and she's the author of How India Became Democratic, Citizenship and the Making of the Universal Franchise. I am pleased to welcome them to the podcast. Rohit, Ornit, congrats on the book, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So I want to start by asking you a little bit about the origin story of this book, which, every book has its origin story, but this one is rather unique. In the acknowledgments, you write that the two of you didn't originally set out to write a book together, but the project evolved organically from your individual archival research and kind of ongoing conversations about the Constitution. Ornit, maybe let me start with you. What brought the two of you ultimately together to write this book?
Indeed, it was, bottom line, it was a gradual and organic process. When Rohit worked on A People's Constitution and I worked on How India Became Democratic, we have been having a lot of conversations because both books are also in kind of dialogue with each other. They both look from different perspectives on the question of the Constitution, engagement with people. And at the time when we finished the book, we talked and we realized that each of us, while working on our previous book, started to collect materials about the engagement of the Indian public with the Constitution while it was in the making. And so basically the process started when we finished our books from conversations and discovery of, both of us discovered such materials. Initially, we thought maybe we should organize a conference to rethink the question of the making of the Constitution. We even had a program already, a draft program, and, we thought about that. Then COVID came up, and basically we started the conversation we were having about the materials we each collected. We were sitting and, on Zoom meetings from afar, or initially in Cambridge, I think it was, we were discussing our materials jointly. And this jointly discussing the material started a gradual, more structured process where we met on a weekly basis for a few hours, a few times a week, and just read together the archival materials. At that time, we realized that some of the materials we have are, we have exactly the same things, but we also discovered, for example, a file that Rohit had the first part, I had the second part, which he didn't have. And so we discovered this, the fact that we have all these materials and they're complementary. And we decided to do something historians usually don't do. We decided to combine our archives and we called it the Ornit Rohit Archive, which we still have, which is, with putting together all the materials and got into a process of reading the materials together and discussing them. And it was in this process that suddenly the thought of actually we're writing something together while we do it. And that's how it came about. So it's the joint discussion of the archival materials, the joint reflection. It's something that I've never done before. That was the big joy. And that's how it gradually came about organically. I don't know, Rohit, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, and I think we were also both grappling with similar questions, in part because while we were having these conversations, if you remember around 2019, 2020, there were widespread sort of public mobilization in India where there were public readings of the Constitution, and in all the commentary there was a kind of pleased note around it, but also a surprise that, oh, this is the first time we see the public engaging with the Constitution. And we knew from the materials we had seen that that wasn't true. We are also lucky to be living through a generation of really exciting work on the Constitution. And while many of the scholars disagree on many points, there is a kind of shared consensus that the Constitution and the ideas it contains really came from a small section of very forward-thinking nationalist leadership, which would not explain the kind of public engagement that we see. So we also very strongly felt that there had to be a kind of historical account that sort of showed this longer history of public engagement with the Constitution, something that, we also witnessed when we were looking at our previous book. So in Ornit's book, it was quite clear that when the election rolls were being drawn up, ordinary people were sort of constantly pushing back at the bureaucrats. Or in my book, People's Constitution, literally the day the Constitution goes into force, people start moving the courts, sort of framing their claims in a constitutional language. And this doesn't come out of thin air. There's obviously a sort of larger sense of ownership around it that allows this to happen.
I mean, this is a kind of natural segue to the writing process, which I don't know about you guys, but whenever I listen to interviews with authors, I'm always fascinated by, how they actually do their work. And again, in the acknowledgments, you write that you literally compose the book together, sometimes word by word, line by line, seated at the same table over lengthy weeks in India, the UK, the US, and occasionally on Zoom across seas. That's how you put it in the acknowledgments. Ornit, is this something that you planned? I mean, again, it sounds like it just sort of emerged organically, but it's one thing to do something jointly in a co-authored way, but it's another thing to actually sit shoulder to shoulder with someone and write at the same time.
It was completely unplanned. And beyond that, I think we say that as well. None of us ever imagined writing a book with someone else. And in fact, at the time, each of us was embarking on a new project, right? Rohit was doing his new project, and I was busy with my new project, which we both put aside in order to do this book, in some ways taking on from the last things that Rohit was saying, the fact that we almost got into ourselves the fever of constitutionalism that was, going on in India at the time. And we were so excited and passionate to do that. So we completely didn't plan it. It was really, organically from the discussion, we kind of thought, okay, so maybe we actually have an article. So we started to write. Initially, we thought, and that's ultimately the article that came out in the past and present. But we then very quickly, we realized that we have a book. We also could imagine the structure of the book. And so that's how it started. And so it was organic. It was unplanned. And I think that the notion of word for word, line by line, literally as it's written in the acknowledgement, is a direct result of the process of the reading of the materials and of reflecting together on them, where each of us bring different things to the materials, where we discuss, and then we have long discussion of what would be coming in, much of our discussion was about what we're going to choose to come into the book, because so much is left outside. So it was, I think it's the process of the reading and thinking that gave birth to the kind of writing. And it would Rohit would start a sentence, I would complete it, we would rewrite it together. And of course, initially it was much slower process, but there were these funny moments by the time we wrote our 5th and 6th chapter, where we felt that our prose is completely aligned and we kind of really complete each other's sentences. So it was a fun process to do that.
I think we started this conversation by kind of positioning your book as a kind of revisionist account. And maybe it's worth backing up a second and talking about what the kind of conventional wisdom has been. As you put out in the book, the kind of canonical account of India's constitution really focuses very narrowly on the Constituent Assembly and the debates and the various texts it produced, I think between around December 1946 and November of 1949. And Rohit, the book really takes aim at this prevailing narrative. And I wonder if you could just spend a second telling us, what is missing from the conventional account, and at a kind of macro level, how does your book revise our understanding?
Sure. Maybe I'll start. We want to emphasize that the fact that India had a Constituent Assembly and it had, by to a large extent, popular leaders in the Assembly is something that is unique amongst British colonies. And the debates in the Assembly are significant. However, since sort of the Granville Austin sort of opus in the 60s and Shivani Kinkar Chaube's book, all the work that has come out around the Constitution of India has really focused on debates in the Assembly, and they've had 3 or 4 sort of shared assumptions. One is that, very crudely, that the Constitution in its sort of most democratic form emerges because of the kind of benevolence of India's nationalist elite. They kind of gave the Indian people a constitution. The people weren't really sure of what they were getting. Secondly, it focuses on
well, just to add, some people have gone further to say not just sure that they of what they were getting, but not equipped, not prepared, not fundamentally liberal or democratic.
And this is across sort of, the political spectrum. There's either a sense that this is democratic ideas on undemocratic soil, or, to take kind of nativist argument, these are foreign ideas that are not organic to Indian society. Secondly, there's a sense that this is a very coherent set of debates that are happening almost in real time in this closed, insulated room where people are talking to each other. And you can understand what goes into the Constitution, the life it has, simply by looking at the debates within the chamber. I think what we're offering is a kind of paradigm shift where the Constituent Assembly is just one node in a much larger set of conversations. And to understand both the shape the Constitution takes and its sort of future career, we have to look at the engagements that happen outside. Now, some of these engagements are the thousands of people and organizations who are writing to the Assembly, and in course of writing, also meeting, debating, engaging with these ideas within their own communities. It's also the fact that the members of the Assembly themselves are not isolated actors. They're constantly in conversation with these groups outside, and they are being influenced and shaped by them. And finally, that the story of India's constitution doesn't end in 1950. And that's a sense that both the constitution makers in the Assembly and the constitution sort of engagers outside are very aware of. So the constitutional text and meaning continues to adapt. And this is a kind of shared understanding that people have. In some ways, there's a kind of conventional wisdom in constitutional theory that, you have three components to a constitutional culture. You have a text, which is the first thing that arrives. Then you have a set of shared practices around the text. These are practices of governments, bureaucrats, lawyers, and judges. And the shared practices in the text often lead to a reaction from society that might come together, engage, and change it. And what we're suggesting is actually to invert the sequence and to look at sort of this insurgent engagement as something that happens even prior to the text.
I think one question which arises, and I don't know which one of you wants to take this on, is whether this book is making a broader challenge to the literature on kind of democratic constitutionalism writ large, or is there something distinctive or kind of sui generis about the Indian case, right? Because one of the things you say, just to kind of put what you said in slightly different words coming from the text of the book, is you say, look, constitutionalism is often portrayed as a means of constraining democratic politics, right? And what your book is arguing is that the widespread public engagement with constitution making made constitutionalism integral to democratic politics, right? Which strikes me as a much larger point that could transcend India's own boundaries.
Right. So if I'll start, maybe, one way to address what you're saying, or first to, indeed, what we're showing is, in fact, the public engagement, its intensity was constitutive of, the making of the Constitution. One thing is that the answer can be, we don't know whether it's unique to India or not unique to India, because, and that goes back to what Rohit was discussing just, in relation to the previous question, the question, what people thought about the Constitution making was never asked. And when we think about the making of India's Constitution, right, there's so much literature, and this question was not asked, basically because of what you said, Milan, the assumption that it was beyond their born or tracing their imagination. We don't know if, maybe our book calls for research about what people thought about the Constitution when it was made in other safe post-colonial setting. In Pakistan, there's now new research by Mariam Khan that shows evidence of at least women's engagement with question of constitution making. So that's one way to look at it. It calls for more research for us to know in terms of the uniqueness or whether it's different. The fact that it actually calls for some rethinking of democratization and constitutionalism, yes, exactly in that way, because it had, the process of democratization. You can say that the process of democratization in India at the time was part and, or I'll put it differently, the making of the constitution, public engagement with constitution making was inherent also to the process of democratization in the sense of how people were already, not waiting for the text, but already imagining how is that they were test trialing, how will that affect our lives? What can be corrected while it's in a draft form, right? When the draft is published, they ask the Constituent Assembly for amendments and changes. And then even before that, when they think, okay, that's what the Constitution means, they start to write their own text and send it to the Assembly. So they already start to imagine what would it mean to live under this Constitution. They're not making for a top-down Constitution to come, this is the narrative, right? This discerning elite that gave a Constitution. But, the way I kind of personally started to think about this project was because I read Rohit's book and I thought, wow, but I said, it can't be that, butchers, sex workers, address the Supreme Court based on the Constitution, making innovative argument just a month after the Constitution comes into force. They already have the constitutional language and in such sophisticated manners. So in that sense, yes, I think it calls for rethinking.
And I think a couple of, a lot of constitutional theory sort of takes the American experience really as the norm, and the kind of democratic critique of the American experience today, that is a constitution that's very difficult to change. Its meaning is very sharply controlled by a fairly partisan Supreme Court, which has life appointments. That doesn't really represent the kind of vast majority of world constitutional systems. And secondly, to the extent that the Indian case stands, and there must be many other places that are similar, is that India in 1946 had, almost 50 to 100 years of a history of people and organizations that had learned how to engage collectively and engage with the state. So this constant refrain that these ideas are alien or the vocabulary is alien is simply not true, because as we find, even groups that you would not imagine would be familiar with this language are able to harness and translate their demands into this language of liberal constitutionalism. So it's not a language that is alien to the people of India. It's a language that actually emerges quite organically from many of these exchanges.
And just to add one more point, I think one of the interesting things we find with this, what we call fever of constitutional expectations, is the way Indian publics are able to think beyond, liberal constitutional thinking that has been like the norm of thinking about constitution making. So immediately fundamental rights are not enough. They think about what about the means of enforcement? They think therefore and they also think about norms, about rights that, are coming into the discourse of legal discourses later on in the 80s. For example, disability rights, right to food, right to education, all these things we see at the time because people think while they're informed by their daily life. And that brings in, that obviously sets the scene for what democratic politics, democratization would look like, especially since at the time they're also waiting for the first elections. There's the notion of now there is universal franchise, and that is also inherently part of the way they think about what the Constitution would mean for their lives.
There's a practical issue here, which you talk about in the book, but I think it's one that some of our listeners might be thinking about, which is, so much of the constitutional correspondence is taking place in English. But you argue that, contrary to expectation, this didn't actually preclude broad public participation. And Ornit, maybe I could just ask you, here's a country where English at that time was largely confined to the elites. Poverty and illiteracy, we know, were widespread. How did communities overcome the barriers of kind of linguistic and social barriers that allowed them to engage in constitution making despite not being fluent in English?
Yeah, so, so 2-3 points. One, there's quite a lot of literature that shows us that despite not reading or speaking English, Indians were reading or listening to the news or reading newspapers because of the practice of communal reading, whether it's in rural India, where one person who can read, whether it's a vernacular a newspaper or English, read it to everyone else, and that's the way it's done. And a lot of, by the way, what we show in the book is that so much of the press was also published in vernacular languages, right, across India. But the public was, one of the things is how the public made deliberate efforts to both speak in the language of the Constituent Assembly and in translating what is happening at the Constituent Assembly to their publics. And the process of public engagement, as Rohit mentioned, was not simply, a group, individuals. It was the groups that were writing, the publics that were writing were, making their assemblies, right? It was big public meetings. It was discussions. It was then a committee. They wrote a memorandum. They sent it to the assembly. So all these public deliberations, whether they were taking place in vernacular languages and then translated into English by those leaders who spoke English, but it was all, in that way, it was disseminated across. So the fact that tribal people made the effort to send memorandums written in English to the assembly, should we dismiss it because it's written in English? Or actually, we should see here the efforts they made to speak to the Constituent Assembly in its language to pursue their demands. It's even more than that. When, for example, one of the representatives of the Castes to the Committee for Tribal Areas in the Northeast, Mavis Dunn, comes to talk to the committee, and she is the first Caste woman lawyer. She speaks English. Obviously, she's very articulated when she speaks with the committee. But then when the committee asks her about, okay, so can we decide that, or can we take that as a kind of view of the Castes? And she said, well, no, I have to go back and speak with the Castes and talk to, the concept of representation is such that she's not the representative. As such, she's almost like the means of speaking to the committee, and then she has to go back and obviously going back and speaking to the language. But the other point about the efforts to vernacularize all this discussion and the constitution making is, and we describe it in our second chapter, we have an analysis of how from the moment the constitution, the draft constitution is published, there efforts across India of organizations writing to the assembly to translate the text. There's an organization in Bombay, I forget their name, who suggests to translate it to, 5 or 6 different languages, in order to, and the Constituent Assembly Secretariat are quite alarmed when they get this request. Can you authorize our translation into Kannada? Can you? Because they say, well, it is going to be published in Hindi and Urdu, but we can't authorize these, of course, because this is also the draft. It's going to change. So we don't think that the fact it was in English took away from this public engagement.
Yeah, just to add, there are so this is not just true for the mid-20th century states. So, whenever people have tried to communicate with the state, they have written to the state in its own language. So in Persian in earlier times. And the few examples we had of people trying to communicate in a language outside of English, Hindi or the Urdu, sometimes they're not heard. So we have this Tamil letter, which really causes, it just moves from Delhi and back to Madras because even the Tamilian bureaucrats can't actually read Tamil. So the only way you can be heard is if you make the effort to write in English. And we see that most of these communities become aware of that and they know that. I think the Northeast is particularly striking because especially in the Khasi areas, we have evidence that there were groups meeting in every village. They were sort of translating the material into Khasi. But eventually when the document would be formed, it would be a document written in English and then sent to Delhi. So there is, these are communities that are aware how communications happen on both ends. And I think one of the imaginative reconstructions we had to do is that for every document we have, we know there have been like dozens of documents behind it that are not visible, like calling people to a meeting, exchanging letters in the first place, maybe passing a resolution. And many of those conversations would have not happened in English. And finally, I mean, one of the interesting things is that much of the language of constitutionalism is in English. So we see a lot of people trying to find equivalent phrases in Indian languages. And there's a lot of linguistic creativity on how do you translate rights or how do you translate Constituent Assembly. And in some ways, the Hindi and Urdu official translators are constantly playing catch up. And one of the more interesting letters is from the Hindustani Prachar Sabha, which has a table where it puts in the Hindi phrase, the Urdu phrase, and what they call the Hindustani phrase. And it's quite clear the only one that's really legible is the Hindustani phrase, which is using a kind of Rozmarre ki zindagi sort of language, whereas the Urdu and Hindi phrases are deeply Sanskritized and Persianized and not things that are self-evident in themselves.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I mean, this kind of leads me to the chapter, I think it's chapter 1, which looks at the role of caste, right? And in this chapter, you're looking at the role of caste, the quest to kind of abolish untouchability, the establishment of reservations for Dalits. And Rohit, in the book, you argue that many of these provisions, which ended up in the Constitution, were won through a lot of organized struggle, right? Again, sticking with the larger theme, these were not just kind of bestowed by benevolent elites. They really were or the product of bottom up. I want to ask you a little bit about the forms this activism took, right? I mean, and what evidence do we have that whatever Dalit organizations or citizens were agitating about actually influenced the constitution-making process?
So, the conventional narrative always is that these were things that were inevitably going to happen, right? So the national movement it was natural that independent India would abolish untouchability and provide this dramatic change to the caste order. However, the assembly itself had no separate representation for Dalit members. In fact, when the cabinet mission plan is sort of making these concessions, the Scheduled Caste Federation, that is Dr. Ambedkar's party, sort of mobilizes on the street in Bombay outside the Congress offices, courting arrest, demanding that they be represented. Much is also made of the divide of the Dalit members inside the Congress and, leaders like Ambedkar. But we also find that there is a convention of all Dalit and tribal members of the Constituent Assembly, but also all legislatures across India who come together and create a common platform of demands, which they send not just to the Assembly members, but also to all 700 members of the British Parliament. So there's a way in which they're trying to ensure that these demands are held accountable. And throughout, we see that the letters that are being sent are followed by agitation on the ground, but also not sent as a kind of, request, but a real assertion, an assertion that is based on both a history of discrimination, but also claim around numbers. The two things that we've found that were unexpected is actually a lot of letters from groups that were called backward caste, a topic that we think is current today, and it wasn't really addressed by the assembly at that time. And in some ways, backward caste members were underrepresented in the assembly, and they point it out. And at one point, one of the groups from Uttar Pradesh, the Nai Samaj, says that, who are you, the minority of the people, to decide how much of jobs and seats the majority of us should get? There's also an interesting set of responses from upper caste groups who are mobilizing against the abolition of untouchability and the provision of affirmative action. And it's interesting, even in their letters, where initially they couch their demands on the kind of grounds that they would make in colonial India, that this is about a right of our community. It's a custom. It is about a custom that has to be respected. It's about our ritual status. And within a few months, it's quite clear that this language is not going to work. So they then start reframing their demands as, well, actually, as Orthodox upper caste Hindus, we're a religious minority. So we should, like, Muslims and Christians, be exempt from certain practices of the state. And they say that, we should have Hindu religious leaders in parliament, and Christian religious leaders and Muslim religious leaders, the same way that the British parliament has bishops inside them. So they're also trying to find a way in which they can couch, what we would say are perhaps non-progressive demands in this kind of language of constitutionalism. And it's quite clear that on that ground, at least, they do not win, which makes it clear that there is a struggle on the grounds inside the party and in the assembly. And famously, of course, Ambedkar lends his weight to many of these struggles, at one point threatening to resign from his position if the kind of demands for affirmative action and jobs, etc., are not granted.
One of the most interesting parts of the book, I thought, was the section on the princely states, because, again, as you point out in the book, a lot of the constitution making that took place within the princely states is like completely absent from the story of their integration into the Indian Union, and I'm thinking here also of like Rahul Sagar's work, right, who has been uncovering, including in his latest book, all of these papers which come from various princely states to show that there was actually quite a lot of thinking that went into the constitution making process within the native states. Ornit, I guess I want to ask you kind of two questions. One is, give us a sense of how widespread these constitution-making efforts were. And then number two, how seriously did princely rulers invest in this idea of constitutional reform?
So it was on a very large scale. And in fact, constitution-making processes in the princely states took place at the scale of, the kind of regional of all princely states and local. So, already from early 1946, the Chamber of Princes issues these basically almost order memorandum to the states to start think about constitutions, setting constitutions to the state, and send them even a list of 6 fundamental rights that should be part of these constitutions. Among them was one of these fundamental rights was the abolition of forced labor, right? And this is happening months before the Constituent Assembly convened in Delhi. So that was at the kind of top level of the politics of princely state. But the more interesting thing is what is happening in the state. So how large scale it is, I think we say in the book, we were able to trace close to 70-something constitutions of princely states and of individual constitution making, but it's hundreds more, because as we show in the book, initially many states start their own constitution making process, and they started some before the assembly convenes, some as the assembly convenes. I'll say in a moment something about the seriousness of this process. But then, as the constitution-making process in Delhi is taking place, many of the states start a process of what we call pooling their sovereignty, so creating unions of states that then elect constituent assembly for them and embark on question of constituting them and constitution making for them. So yes, it's happening across the princely states. In fact, we say if you imagine a map of India at the time between December 46 and November 49, when the constitution is adopted by the Constituent Assembly in Delhi, and you put a dot of the Constituent Assembly in Delhi, right? The place where the canonical account, this is the contained space and place of constitution making. You'll also add dots of every place in India where princely states made constitution making, let alone the public. It will cover the whole region, which was 45% of the territory of India, 93 million people. So the rulers engaged very deeply with the constitution making process. We go deeply in the book into 2 cases, the Reva and Ratlam, and to show how serious was the process. So, the process involved. So the process we described was similar in other places. So it was about, of course, it was a response of the rulers to popular demands for self-government, for more representative government. So it was about appointing a committee. It was about the public vetting on who will chair the committee in Reva, right? In Reva, the original chair of the committee was not accepted by the public because they wanted someone who understood the language, who would engage with the people. It was committees who published called for, did public hearings. In the case of Reva, Hari Gursing, who was the chair of the committee, was touring Reva, meeting with people. He describes in his memorandum hundreds of people coming to each one of these gatherings. We got letters from scheduled caste, from tribal groups, scheduled caste groups, Muslim groups who actually have their own vision of what they want from the future constitution. For example, these weak groups wanted to retain the ruler because they felt that only the Maharaja would take care of their rights, and they were afraid of the coming of, a new politics where there's no the traditional, guardian of their rights. You look at the Ratlam process. So in Reva, for example, then the constitution is being published for comments. So there's a lot of iteration and people that come and speak. In Ratlam, the committee initially think that women should not necessarily have franchise because of backwardness, but then it was public engagement with the process that made them change the draft constitution of Ratlam to have voting rights for women. There's also a lot of innovations in the princely state constitution in the sense, one thing is that the constitution making processes in the states outpaces the process of the constitution making in the Constituent Assembly. So before the drafting committee meets for the first time to start its discussion, in some princely states, abolition of untouchability has already happened.
Yeah, the princely states have always been an interesting site, and I think Rahul's work shows that there have often been these occasional figures who have crafted these works of political theory in some of these states. But, to be clear, most of these states were authoritarian, autocratic, and were not willing to sort of concede power to the masses. There's really something about the moment in 1946 where it becomes clear to the princes that the only way that they can retain some form of sovereignty and to prevent the Indian Union from coming in and taking them over is to have this constitution, both as evidence that they can enact democratic reforms, but also to sort of, and transform to a constitutional monarchy. So they take it seriously. As our chapter shows, originally the Indian Assembly was supposed to have no authority to make constitutions for the princely states. There was supposed to be an appendix at the end that would list all the state constitutions. However, it's through this process where they were making constitutions, and they were sending members to Delhi that paradoxically, the making of the constitution that they were doing to protect themselves got them drawn further into the kind of Indian constitutional structure, and these ideas sort of proliferated across the board. We also often think of the possibility this was going to be inevitable, that all the princely states would be integrated. But actually, if we look around different parts of the former British Empire, Malaysia, the UAE, Uganda in its early years, there were many forms where they would have integrated princely territories and British territories together and created a kind of federal regime. So there were moments of alternative possibilities in between 46 and 49 that some of these examples sort of show.
And just one last thing that we kind of the fact is that if you look at the November 1949 Constitution that was adopted by the Constituent Assembly, you see that there are many things from the constitutions of the states that found their place in the Indian constitution, in the constitutional text. We can't see them today because we see them as asterisks of something that was amended, and most of them were disappearing by the 1970s. But, for example, 4 states even retained their armies, and that was part of the constitution. There were clauses that stipulated areas wherein the Indian government cannot intervene in the states. And all that appears in the 49 draft, which we usually don't even look at, right? So, because when you search the text of the Indian Constitution, you don't see those clauses from the states' constitutions.
And in some ways, the origins of India's asymmetric federalism actually comes from some of these negotiations. So it's not just Kashmir, but also many of these other princely states that are able to win certain concessions for border districts or certain privileges. And the idea that you can't have one size that fits all. You have Part A, Part B, and Part C states comes through some of these conversations and negotiations.
This is actually a good segue to asking about Manipur, because this is a state that had its own democratic constitution. It had elected a state assembly. Neither of those things prevented its eventual incorporation into India. And so, Rohit, if I could just ask you, say a little bit about what was distinctive about Manipur's democratic experiment, and how did New Delhi come to ultimately assert control over this part of the country?
So, I mean, there are, I think, three princely states that provide kind of interesting counterexamples. There's Kashmir, there's Hyderabad, and there's Manipur. And Kashmir, of course, there's much that's written about, but we want to state that Kashmir actually is able, at least in 1950, to kind of retain a state constitution after independence. It's the only one that manages to do that. Hyderabad is really interesting because Hyderabad is supposed to send 16 members to the assembly in Delhi. It never does that. Kashmir ultimately sends 4 members to the Constituent Assembly in Delhi. So Hyderabad does not have any membership in the assembly. The Hyderabad members do not sign. The constitution is ultimately sort of applied to the territory of Hyderabad by the Nizam. However, Hyderabad, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh become the kind of sites of constitutional change. In fact, the first major change, which is states reorganization, is because of mobilization in what is Hyderabad. Manipur is often forgotten, but is sort of unique in being one of the first princely states to clearly have a constitution that abolishes death penalty, does not provide for emergency provisions, and also brings in universal adult franchise. They have a government on that respect. And when the Indian Union is trying to get the Maharaja to a seat, the Maharaja keeps saying, but I've already transferred my powers to this assembly, so I don't have the authority to a seat. I have to go back and ask my assembly. And as we show in the chapter, there are various attempts. For example, what you would do in almost any other princely state is to sort of use the office of the Diwan to suggest that emergency powers can be applied. But the constitution of Manipur does not have a provision for emergency powers. So we see a lot of correspondence where the Indian Union's legal advisors are like, how exactly do we go about doing this? Because it's not clear that we can do this based on what the Manipur constitution says. And eventually, of course, it's sort of realpolitik that wins out. There are concerns about border areas, supposed communist activity, and there are many accounts of how Manipur was eventually sort of integrated into the union and turned into a chief commissioner's province. But the constitution of Manipur does provide a kind of hurdle to be navigated. And there's a Guwahati High Court decision from 1956 involving, I think, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, which basically says that to the extent that the constitution does not take away from the Indian constitution, it's not clear that constitution is abrogated. So, yeah.
And just to add to that, it relates very well to your previous question, because what we're showing with the Manipur case, which is a section in our chapter, is to show how serious was the constitution making process in Manipur, right? So it started in April 1947, there was a committee. The constitution is inaugurated in October 1948. A franchise committee is established, is seated, is deciding how to divide, constituencies, having hearing, etc. And then once the June 48 elections on the basis of universal franchise takes place in Manipur, it's a big elections, and the new legislative assembly takes power. And this is like 1948. It's just, months after the draft constitution is being published, the Indian draft constitution. This we show from following gazettes. We show in the chapter how this legislative assembly takes a lot of decisions. They legislate. So it's a very active democratic government in Manipur. So to see that on the one hand, which shows the result of a very serious constitution making process, and on the other hand, the effort to sabotage it. There's no other way to put it by the Indian government, because they want to take over Manipur, and to see how legally difficult it is for them when we, reading the legal opinions that Rohit was referring to, I think is a mark of showing the seriousness of these processes. And in one way, it's a trouble area where it was never resolved, right? It was taken over rather than resolved constitutionally, as it was through the processes of parallel ongoing constitution-making dialogues processes as in most of the rest of India.
Let me try and bring this conversation to an end, maybe by asking you about, what you hope the broader public takes away from this book. One of the objectives, as you put it in one of the final chapters, is to put the public back into the republic. That's one of the key takeaways. But as people are reading this, what do you want them to remember? And what relevance do you think it has for the constitutional and democratic challenges that India faces in this day and age in 2026? Rohit, let me start with you, and then I'll ask Ornit to weigh in as well.
Sure. So I think the one takeaway we want to really emphasize, and it's something you find in the archives, is really a culture of civic and public engagement, which we were fortunate to have around 1946. This has two components. One, of course, that a public that feels it can come together and engage not just in making demands for itself, but placing their demands through a process of public reasoning. So this is not kind of hostage bargaining with the state, but making claims in a language that can be shared. And secondly, for the state to allow these channels of communication to exist. Public participation can't just work if it's top down. So there have been studies on Nepal, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, which have shown that when public participation is a box to be ticked as a good practice, the level of engagement and input is not very high, and it often leads to a kind of failure of the constitutional process. What made India different was that the process was organic, and to some extent, the state and political parties were responsive. I think it is important to also recognize that the meaning of the Constitution is not fixed and controlled by certain elites, be they judges or constitutional thinkers, but is one that is shaped through public dialogue and conversation.
So if I can add to that, one thing is you asked about the relevance. So, at a time where there are arguments in India, or they have been, especially ahead of the 2024 elections, that, if the government would come to power with a large majority, there's a need to maybe rewrite the constitution. It's not Indian. It's not the people's. It's a colonial constitution. And one of the things that I think our book makes very clear is that it's very difficult to argue that it is. It's Rohit's book's title, a people's constitution, but it's the Indian people's constitution. One of the big things we show in the book, and that's part of our argument, is how through the process of engagement with the Constitution, making people appropriated it and made it their own. So it is the People's Constitution. And another little point is that I think we write it in the introduction that we take the reader, you said what we want the readers to take from it, we take the reader into this journey of constitution making across different sites across India with the hope we think that almost every Indian can find some roots of his family in one way or another in the breadth of stories and constitution making processes we talked about in the book. In fact, we had few nice emails coming from people that we never met, we never knew, who kind of send an email with even a picture.
One of the nice ones really has been people saying that, actually, I'm from Ratlam and I've never seen Ratlam mentioned in any discussion of the Constitution. Or somebody saying, this letter that you have with these initials, that was actually my grandmother, who was sort of a politician in Bihar. So I think there are pieces of it. And Ornit and I just scratch and bring in just a small amount of the materials that we looked at. So there's really a kind of invitation for others to go in and examine the rest of these archives and these voices and pick up on topics that, we haven't focused on, but are really there. And in some ways, many of the questions and issues remain the same for Indian politics today.
My guests on the show this week are Rohit Dey and Ornit Shani. Together, they are the authors of Assembling India's Constitution, A New Democratic History. This is just a fantastic book that I was telling both Rohit and Ornit before we started recording that I loved it for two reasons. One is it's just incredibly inventive and novel. The argument of the book and challenges, I think, a lot of what most of us have come to understand about how the Constitution was written. But the second is just it's a really elegantly written book with just incredible evidence, but just a really nice kind of narrative and storyline. Congrats to both of you on the book, and thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you for your generous engagement.
Thanks, Joy. Milan, thank you so much.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps other people find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Aizen Familetti is our executive producer. Additional assistance provided by Andy Rabina. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.